it's not actually a fair test of, or a scientifically pure test of what the hybrids would usually experience, right? Because you have an uncontrolled variable has entered, the test tube has become contaminated because the damn aliens have gotten hold of it. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political science professors who have just watched episode 4 of Alien Earth. The episode's called Observation. We are here to give our fairly instant breakdown of the ideas, the themes that we saw in this episode. As always, these are just our sort of fairly instant reactions. We would love to hear from you what your reactions are. We had some really great comments we have had actually throughout the series that have really helped us kind of understand things we might have not seen initially or got wrong or just advanced our analysis of the show. So please get down in the comments section and get involved. We always interact with the comments and we really love receiving them. We have, as I said, just watched this episode, Jeff, and I think we have not a disagreement, but we have we have two views on what the main theme of the episode was. That doesn't mean we can't both be right. It's a rich enough text that there could actually be two through lines, but maybe one of us is catastrophically wrong. But why don't you give us your take?
I don't see us in really opposition here. I think that there are two big ideas that are emerging more and more in this series. The two big themes, on one hand, as you noted off camera, it plays on the name or the title of this episode, Observation. So here the reference is a scientific observation.
Yeah, so observation is the name of the episode. Observation is a term from the scientific method, particularly the positivist scientific method, where you'd say, look, here is a phenomena in the world. Entirely separate from that is an observer, a scientist, and what the scientist is going to do is sort of make measurements using their sensors of this phenomena and see how the phenomena responds, and therefore then we will get data and we will understand the phenomena.
And crucially, the observer is a neutral party.
Neutral and separate from the phenomena that's being observed.
A modest, distant viewer of the thing, right? Which requires, as you say, full separation between the thing being observed and the person doing the observing.
Right, and of course that's going to clash with the dominant problematic of the show, which is about the inability to really maintain stable boundaries between anything, right? Between the artificial and the and the natural, the biological and cognitive. We've seen Alien has always been about that kind of penetrative boundary crossing, and we've seen that really kind of supercharged in this show. And in a number of ways in this episode, I think that the scientific method is being kind of subverted, whether it's by the introduction of the aliens, which is one of the main things it's the reason the aliens are in the show, right? Is to kind of, cross boundaries, or whether it's by the non-scientific impulses of people who purport to be doing science, such as Boy Cavalier, or even the fairly sort of Frankensteinian scientific methodology of people like Kirsch. These are not non-intrusive experiments they're running. They're just literally trying to what would happen if we put one biological organism inside the other?
Yeah, and so these are really sharp points, that the scientific method, as it has been handed down over the last couple of centuries as a part of sort of modernist understanding and thinking in the world, very much linked to the Enlightenment era of thinking, it really demands a kind of what I think this show is pointing out, and which a lot of people have pointed out in different venues. The scientific method demands a kind of impossible separation between things. It demands the idea that things are not connected in the world, or that they can be severed, that obvious and natural connections can be severed. In this case, the connection that the scientific method wants to insist can be severed is the disconnect between the observer's neutrality and the observer's desire. And we see this over and over again. What's happening in these scientific experiments? Well, it's the intrusion of the desires of the observer to manipulate, to see, to put themselves in pride of place. Boy Cavalier does this particularly, as we also talked about off camera, when they're doing the experiment with the sheep, and the eyeballs are mirrored, right? Boy Cavalier's eyeball is mirrored with the alien eyeball inside of the sheep. And as you noted, the only thing that Boy Cavalier says to the sheep is me.
Yes, it's stop the experiment, stop everything else. Alien sheep, alien possessed sheep. Look at me. I'm the sender of this. We're the ones who are going to have this kind of interaction.
So as you say, this is not neutral observation. This is the scientist, so to speak, from the outside, altering and manipulating the actual experiment calling attention, demanding attention from the observed to the observer in a way that, as you say, I think quite rightly, just completely effaces and obliterates the supposed distinction that the scientific method, a set of distinctions that the scientific method relies upon.
Yeah, and there's a couple of the key points in the episode that I want to come back to kind of drive home this point about observation and science and its subversion. But you have a secondary, well, not a secondary view, an alternate view on what you think the episode is really about.
I think that the series has been building towards this, and we began to really see it, I thought, a lot last week. And this is the question of what is the relationship, or what are the relationships like between parents and children, or between adults and children in this kind of transhumanistic era. And to me, it was very notable that pretty much all of our scenes revolved around the elaboration of a series of relationships between the different Lost Boys, between Wendy and the different Lost Boys, and some adult figure. And sometimes in very obvious and explicit ways, these adult figures are pitched or are pitching themselves as parents, right, to these synthetic Lost Boys. Sometimes it's ambivalent what the relationship is, but it's notable that at this point, right, I guess we're halfway through the series. At this point, the show, it seems to me, has gone to pains to insist that each of these Lost Boys has some sort of adult/parental figure in their lives, and that a lot of what's happening in these relationships, it's manipulative, it's dysfunctional, it's exploring, it seems to me, again, some of the questions that I was left with at the end of last week's episode, which is what happens to that relationship between parents and children, between siblings? What happens to familial relationships when perhaps one of the parties in that relationship dies? What happens to that relationship when one of the parties, at least, is not fully human? And more broadly, what is it about the process or the experience of being human that relies upon particular kinds of familial dynamics? Right? How important, and in what kinds of central ways in particular is it important that the experience of being human is the experience of being a part of a family?
Joey's in an ambiguous familial position. He's a brother, but he's also, because he's now, well, he was always older than Marcy, but he's in this weird position of now being a sort of father figure to her, because she's sort of severed from her own father figure. Arush, we finally learn his name, slightly, is in a position where Morrow has inserted himself as sort of a dominant, even abusive father figure, and is physically proximate to his mother, and he's sort of holding his mother as a hostage to kind of get Arush to do what he wants. There's also a new family dynamic in that Nibs has pronounced that she's pregnant.
Right.
And this is one that crosses actually both themes, because Nibs's pregnancy, which I think we're both agreed is something to do with the octopus eyeball having attached itself to her.
Yes.
Nibs's pregnancy clearly comes from that interaction.
Yes.
May actually be, there may be some physical reality to it, or it may be sort of a psychological seed that's been planted in her. And the discourse that she has about it with the people who could also be seen as father figures, the kind of scientists who are, the sub-boy cavalier scientists in the facility, centers on biological or the scientific process of pregnancy versus a more mystical or religious process of pregnancy. Where
indeed, Nibs announces herself as an immaculate conceiving being.
Exactly. And the scientist says, you know how pregnancies happen, or let me tell you how pregnancies happen and why they biologically, that's the implication, could not have happened to you. And she's like, well, that's all true except for Jesus.
Except for Jesus. And Nibs also subverts even that moment. She says, I grew up on a farm. I know how this works.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, there's so much happening there. But the other thing that's happening is you reminded me as you were talking, this is also all about names and about the reclaiming of names or the revelation of names. Notice what's happening, right? We get a long discourse between Boy Cavalier and Joe about Wendy, right? is she really, or I guess it's not with Boy Cavalier, it's with the sort of right-hand man of Boy Cavalier. Is this
the sinister guy in the suit? Yeah.
Right? Is this really your sister?
Right.
Do you recognize your sister? And Joe insists on calling Wendy Marcy, which is his sister's name. So there's the naming confusion there. There's, as you talked about, right, Morrow basically tricks or manipulates slightly into revealing his real name.
By revealing his own, names are very important, right? My name is Kumi.
Yep. He reveals his name. He creates this kind of, again, we called it last week, a relationship of grooming, and I think that's obvious, right? It has come to fruition this week. He uses that bit of information to get Arush to reveal his name, which is a huge mistake, right? Then we have the moment in which Smee renames himself, right? Isaac. And remember last week...
After a scientist.
After Isaac Newton, of course. And remember last week, it was Nibs who questioned out loud why she couldn't name herself. Why did someone else get to name her, right? So we get these kinds of... In some ways, the proclamation of the name is an act of autonomy.
Well, and Nibs says, my baby's called Clarissa. It's what she wants to be called.
Yes. So... On one hand, the proclamation of a name is an act of autonomy on the part of, beings that are very clearly positioned as children, right? On the other hand, the revelation of a name is an act of treachery and makes one super vulnerable. And so there's all of this there are all these interesting dynamics, it seems to me, that are beginning to develop and be put in place about, again, what is central to the human experience? How are those familiar relations central or not? How is the process of naming, right, and being able to name one's self or being the recipient of a name central to the possibilities of autonomy that are understood to be at the center of human experience as well? So I think the show is starting to get really sophisticated about its kind of existential themes in ways that, as we talked about last week, are really pretty unique and pretty interesting. Now, I think we both agreed off camera, we didn't think that this episode was as strong necessarily as episode 3, but I think it's working through its themes now in ways that are pretty interesting and pretty sophisticated, and again, I think continue to reward a fairly close watch.
Yeah, I think you have to really be into the themes to have enjoyed that episode, and if you are, they were given they were aired with some depth and some nuance and some kind of interconnection. Because the other thing that's going on when Nibs's pregnancy is being discussed is the subversion of the scientific method is on full display, right? The hybrids are supposed to be the beta testing of a new type of humanity, a hybridized transhuman humanity. And those who are more scientifically oriented around Boy Cavalier's outfit need there to be clean observations of what is happening during the initial period of these hybrids coming into existence. And so at the end of the conversation when Nibs has said she's pregnant, she's kind of taken away by the guards, and the scientist who's been interviewing her reports this as a level 3 event, right? We have which is some sort of scientific diagnostic, warning sign that something is going wrong with the hybrids. But of course,
because she's acted out in a hostile fashion.
Sure, but why has she done that, right? It's not actually a fair test of or a scientifically pure test of what the hybrids would usually experience, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have an uncontrolled variable has entered, the test tube has become contaminated because the damn aliens have gotten hold of her. She thinks she's pregnant because the eyeball octopus monster attached itself to her.
Not only that, but she's also been provoked by the supposed observer, right? Who has continued to question her on something that Nibs has told her multiple times she doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really kind of central to one of the central things that was going on in the episode. There's an exchange between the married couple, Arthur and I'm sorry, I'm totally blocking. I keep saying the scientist, the female senior scientist. There's an exchange that initially reads quite strangely, but I think is centrally tied to this thematic of what the episode's about, where Arthur kind of storms out of the facility. And he's upset by this contamination of the scientific process. And they've both said to Boy Cavalier, like, you're really screwing this up, right? Should we not get back to the matter at hand? Have we not got enough on our plate with the hybrids? And he's become entranced with this, shiny new object of the aliens, which are contaminating all the experiments to do with the hybrids. And Arthur says, this isn't science. And he says, in science, something either is or it isn't. Science is a very dichotomous process, which is totally against the show's ethos of you can't draw these hard boundaries, and the ethos of the Alien franchise, which is the things become interpenetrated one way or another. And initially you think, why would the show's chief scientist in a science fiction show just elucidate a philosophy that is running absolutely counter to what the show is about? But the show it's actually dramatizing that inadequacy or failure of the scientific method to comprehend all that is and all that can be, which is a central question of transhumanism, right? How do you comprehend what it means to be human? Is it comprehensible by positivistic processes where all of humanity is information that can be severed from the substrate and changed onto a different, silicon basis, or just become zeros and ones? Or is there something more? Is there something more ethereal or more or less directly observable? And that I think is what the show is getting at with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. I think those are all really, really sharp and interesting points. The show is foreshadowing that our scientist Arthur is not going to meet a good end because he's out of place.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, the show has told us almost from the first minutes of its running that science is out of place. Where are these experiments being conducted? In a place called Neverland.
I think this is crucial.
Right.
So I think this is entirely crucial, and I think it goes to a point that's at the heart of the show as it exists in its generic identity, the genre that it's in. There was a really, really, I think, clever period at the start of the episode, scene at the start of the episode, where Boy Cavalier is asking Wendy, and we should talk about this, Wendy about hearing the xenomorphs, or what her connection is to the xenomorphs. And he says, Wendy's asking, well, how can it be that I have this connection with them? How can I hear them? And Boy Cavalier, and clearly by extension the show, don't really want to get into some of the obvious scientific questions about this, which is, how good is Wendy's hearing, and why, given all the other hybrids can't hear it, why can she hear it? Because the show wants there to be some connection. We actually thought it was kind of psychological or even supernatural, and it's not. It's been revealed as being a matter of the hearing, which is something a commentator said last week. But that creates a number of problems for the show, which is, why can't the other hybrids hear it? How does it seem to have been established at such a great distance between Wendy and the xenomorph? And why does it seem that she not only hears the xenomorph or the egg when it's being cut into, but seems to be physically affected by the xenomorph being cut into? And Boy Cavalier, instead of explaining it or coming up with technobabble, which would be the Star Trek thing, well, if you tech the tech and the phase inducer of the quantum injector, instead of saying that, essentially says, don't worry about that. Right? And he says, Asimov, the great science fiction writer, said, any sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic, which is a quote that really helps him there, because he's saying, look, don't look for a scientific explanation here, because this show is not existing purely as science fiction. Now, that's not what Asimov meant. That's a misuse of that quote. Asimov meant when a really advanced civilization meets a less advanced civilization, their actually scientifically explicable capabilities will appear as magic to the less advanced civilization. But he is, in a sense, by using Asimov, the great science fiction writer, he's sort of, and by extension the show, is sort of making fun of, or tipping the hat to, on making a nod and a wink that this is not straight science fiction, right? And should not be read that way. And so don't worry about things like this, because one of the things he says very shortly thereafter is to do with, it's another quote from Peter Pan. It says, the Neverland was very nearly real now. Very nearly real, I think, is the genre the show is trying to operate in, right? It's close enough that it seems like science fiction, close enough to reality, but it's operating in this strange fairy tale, very nearly real land, where the adventures are very tightly packed together. That's the other line he reads from Peter Pan. And Boy Cavalier is that type of figure. That's his approach to science. He's not a pure scientist, and he's sort of achieving his dreams through science, or he's exercising his megalomaniacal fantasies through science. But in the end, he's not interested in science. He's interested in a set of things that are larger than that are largely centered on him.
Yeah.
And that's where the show is existing, in this generic Neverland, if you like, hinterland between science fiction and fairy tale.
Yeah. And it's a throwback as well to a line or a conversation from episode 3 that makes clear why it's so important that the hybrids are children.
Yeah.
Remember last week in episode 3, he says, children have limitless imaginations, something to that effect, infinite imaginations. So when he says to Wendy, look, it's all there. It's in your hard drive. You heard it. All you have to do now is just open your mouth and let it out.
Yeah.
He's asking her effectively to trust in her imagination, to not worry, as you say, about the science of this, to not worry about how things work technically. Just kind of allow your imagination to run, and you will find it. And you'll be able to reproduce it. You'll be able to reproduce that sound in a way that is actually consistent with how babies produce sound, with how human babies produce sound. And you will undoubtedly remember this as a father of a couple of young children yourselves. Those first couple of weeks in which human babies begin to make noises, they make noises that they will never make again over the course of their lives. Not because necessarily they're endowed with some sort of amazing special biological capacity that dissolves after a few weeks of living, but rather because the scope of potential sounds that exist in the world are far larger than we become accustomed or habituated to hearing on an everyday basis. And so babies can make the most extraordinary sounds. They can mimic the most extraordinary things, not because they have some special capacity, but because they haven't had those sounds habituated out of their lives yet.
Yeah.
And this is effectively, I think, sort of what's happening with Wendy and her capacity to speak xenomorph.
Well, and this sort of brings the themes of the themes we both saw in this episode are brought together in the very final scenes, right? When the xenomorph baby is born from the flesh of Wendy's family, right? Is born from Joe's lung. And all of a sudden, Wendy, for reasons that they've gestured at a scientific explanation for, but also Boy Cavalier has said, don't worry about teching the tech of this.
Right.
Just kind of go with us on this slightly fairy tale-ish leap. Because Wendy can now speak Xeno, effectively, at least to the extent of being able to comfort what is now sort of her baby.
And there's a way that she calls it into life. It's not simply that she's able to speak to it afterwards. Remember, she is kind of sitting and observing, but not observing, speaking to it.
Kind of chittering at it.
Manipulating it. She's bringing it into the world.
Right.
And in doing so in ways that, Kirsch is himself observing and is kind of amazed by. And so the connection seems to be, at this point, it's a very obvious connection, and it feels like a familial connection between Wendy and the xenomorph.
I think so too. So where does this series stand? And I say this having watched a couple of reviews or consumed a bit more of the kind of discourse that's out there on this series this week. And I think the divide, and it's proving divisive, is my reading. I think the divide is caused by whether you are willing to accept its generic positioning between science fiction and fairy tale. And a lot of people are frustrated by what they see as kind of plot holes or hand waving or, things that don't quite make sense. Like, how does the thing about Wendy hearing the Xenos at that distance and then the way it's affecting her and then she can internalize the language, does that really make sense? And there are people who are finding it hard to understand, or some of my initial reservations, like, why send the kids into the crash site? Like, that's thrown a lot of people really kind of out of it. I think the people who are liking it have maybe glommed onto the generic distinctions between science fiction and fairy tale and a kind of accepting or understanding that Alien was always, ironically, a hybrid franchise, right? It was the first movie was hybrid science fiction and horror. The second movie was hybrid science fiction and sort of war movie or action movie. And there's no point, as Noah Hawley has said, in trying to do that same thing again. And there's no real novelty in the Alien life cycle, and you have to do something different. So is it going to work to take an Alien movie that's really hybrid? It's on the surface, the influences, hybrid Blade Runner and Peter Pan.
Yeah, and it harkens back to something that my wife says about sci-fi, which is that sci-fi is always a hybrid of some collection of genres. Now, I know for the hardcore sci-fi people, this is maybe not what they're interested in hearing, but sci-fi is a conglomeration of lots of different things. It's horror, it's westerns, it's romance, it's all of these things. And to imagine it as a pure form of storytelling that could be, for example, scientifically cabined off and excluded from all other influences, sort of misses what is potentially generative about sci-fi. So from my position, what Holly is doing here with this fairly on the surface hybrid form of storytelling between the fairy tale and the sci-fi, is exactly consistent with what we have seen out of the sort of tentpole sci-fi franchises from the beginning.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so let us know what you thought of episode 4. Are we kind of way off base here? Are we off in some kind of academic flight of fancy? For the first time ever in the history of academics, have we taken an intellectual wrong turn into a dead end? Just let us know what you think. And we will see you next week. And on that bombshell,